Good. Great. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Senate Education. We're now, we have Mr. Fannin with us, Vermont NEA, and then we're going to talk to Jay Badham, Superintendent, Norwich Hanover Interstate School. We're jumping into 483. Before we do 483, I just wanted to ask Mr. Fannin, PCB's NEA. We don't have, again, I don't think the Senate's planning on postponing or doing anything. We may look at the rule, but on it, but was wondering if the NEA had taken that decision. I know that you didn't testify in the House.
For the record, Jeff Fannin, Vermont NEA. We understand. I understand you had some conversations out in the hall with Colin, I think briefly last week.
Yeah.
Don't want to engage in conference committee discussions, but certainly.
Well, yeah, we just want to, this is just general testimony.
Sure, I understand.
Yeah.
But it looks like there's a dispute or conversation going on in the House and the Senate, and don't want to interfere with that. However, we want to make sure that the pacing of the testing and school construction are aligned. I'll say it that way.
So you're for the postponement of the testing?
We're in favor of aligning the timeline for testing and construction.
Okay, maybe this is the way. 486, do you support how it's written? 486, which?
I'll just stick to my guns here. I think we are in favor of aligning the timeline for both testing and construction. You know, Don Tinney, the president of Vermont NEA, has been working on the school safety matters for several years. And if you're going to put in a lock on a door, for example, when the vestibule is crumbling around it, that does not make a whole lot of sense. So I think the concept here is we've been wanting to align testing for PCBs. We certainly want them, everybody wants them in the school.
Right.
And we want to make sure the schools are, the school construction happens as well at the same time.
Right.
So it's just aligning the two. And I think that's the needle that you're trying to thread. I know that the House and the Senate are in conversation about that, so we support that. That conversation is ongoing.
Just for what it's worth, I did get two different correspondence from two different superintendents today, actually. Or maybe one today and one last night, I believe, that were in support of pausing the testing. So I think it's worthwhile to continue that conversation.
And as I said, Senator Gillett, 46 will likely end up in the budget since it's tracking with 124, but certainly anything could happen in the budget. Any other questions for Mr. Fannin before we move to 483? And with us, do we have, are you Jay?
Yes, sir.
Hi, good to see you. I'm glad you could be here. So one of the things that has come up with H483 is public school admissions, whether or not there's ever any kind of admission process in our public schools. And that's what we're just trying to figure out. It came up last week and just wanted to raise it with the two of you. You represent teachers, you've been part of the Equity Council, and you are, tell us a little bit.
What's the Equity Council?
We're not the Equity Council, the Equity, what's the group?
Education
Equity Alliance, yeah.
Right.
And you're with?
I'm superintendent of SEU 70, which is one of your interstate school systems. So I serve Norwich, Vermont, and Hanover, New Hampshire.
So we just want to be consistent. What they're asking for in 483 is for, which I don't really have too much of a position on yet. It's kind of an open enrollment where public dollars follow kids to whatever school they want. And I think that's happening in a lot of schools, and I'll look, I don't see Ledge Council here, but I think that's basically what it's doing, is it's saying, if you want to go to whatever school it might be, no interview, sort of no test scores, they could be, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, they could be asked for, but even if, if the family shows them, then it can't be considered in the admission process, basically. And as I'm taking it, again, it's sort of a, want to go to this school, you know, these are public dollars, you can go to the school. So I'm wondering from the two of you who've been in this world for, I think, a while, is there any time that a family just says, or a school would say, public school would say, we just can't take that kid?
So
I guess I would,
I'll start.
Yeah.
Jay can follow up, he's probably the better one. So as I said,
if you want to move up, Jay, you're welcome to. This is sort of joint conversation.
okay.
This is just us trying to get more information on the bill.
Sorry, I don't mean to get you sick.
Quite all right.
So what I'll say, from Vermont EA's perspective, I've been doing this work for 23 years. I've never once been asked about admissions.
Okay.
The Vermont EA members don't get involved. It's an administrator's, trade and craft. And so literally, this is the first time I've ever been asked about admissions whatsoever. So they said in my email last week, I don't have anything knowledgeable to say on this topic.
Yes, please.
So in that case, I would have some questions for Jay. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, please, let's have this, I just want to get to the bottom of some of this
Yeah,
stuff, so yeah, please.
so the admissions process or the enrollment process for a public school, someone like, if you could just expand on, when a family, let's say, moves to a new area, they want to send their student to the school, and that student has different needs, whether it's an IEP or a 504, how would the public school go through that enrollment process or admissions process?
Thank you for the question, and thank you all, Chairman Campion and members. I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and also thank you for your service, wading into these issues when the national debate around education is looking more and more like combat. I really appreciate your work. In my particular district, and in all public school systems, whether it's in Vermont or in New Hampshire, any resident is entitled to admission, and the admissions process, if you want to call it that, or the enrollment process, is quite simple. I did, unfortunately, late send you a packet of information that kind of details those processes for your reference later. But in essence, it's a matter of proving residence, and you're enrolled, and it doesn't matter. The only possible exception that I can contemplate is that if you have an expelled student, a district is not obligated under either Vermont or New Hampshire law to accept a student who's been legally expelled from school. Otherwise, we have an obligation to provide enrollment for any student who's a resident. And the age restriction would be another qualifying factor, and there are slightly different requirements around starting age in New Hampshire and Vermont, but in both states now, thanks to some legislation in New Hampshire, a student with special needs on an IEP or 504 plan is eligible for public school enrollment up through the age of 21. So for a resident student, there are absolutely no bars to enrollment.
Can I ask you
sure.
So for the background, let's say you have a student who was previously expelled. How do you find that out?
Well, there's an exchange of records when a student enrolls from another school system, and so that would be a very well documented process. It's a quasi judicial process when a student is legally expelled from school, and so there is a record generated. I will say that even though we are able to deny admission to students who've been expelled, in the last 20 years, as far as my research can find, we have actually accepted students that have been expelled from other districts in our own school system.
So it's during that exchange of records that you would find out if the student was expelled. But again, you're going to take the student.
Absolutely, especially if it's a resident student, yes.
It's particularly from an operating district,
From
a non-operating district.
From a non-operating district, so with regard to non-resident students, and I do have written testimony, I'll share a brief background here. The laws of both states require us to develop policies to admit non-resident students.
Okay.
It allows us to charge tuition rates that are established by each state, and local policies often delegate the discretion to accept non-resident students to the superintendent. The discretion that they do grant us, though, is tempered by federal and state laws and regulations around non-discrimination. So we're not able to deny admission based on any protected factor. The discretion that we can exercise is cost, capacity, those sorts of considerations. And again, thinking about the expulsion case, we would be able to deny a student enrollment if they had been expelled from a different district. In my 6 years with SAU 70, we have not denied a single non-resident student. In the past 20 years, our counseling department informs me that we did deny a number of students in the early 2000s because there was a population bubble that was working its way through our region. And the high schools in the Upper Valley were absolutely maxed out capacity-wise. So we set a date by which non-resident students had to apply. And any student that applied after that date was not admitted. And it was on a first come, first served basis. So there was no discrimination other than poor timing, I suppose. So since then, you know, there have been a number of different laws passed in the state of New Hampshire, especially, which again is the controlling law for the Dresden School District, which is our middle and high school. And despite that, we're still in a situation where my discretion is tempered by state law.
Two more questions. So sorry if I missed this, but when you're talking about discretion, you mentioned cost and capacity. I get the capacity piece. Can you expand a bit more on the cost piece?
Sure. So if we had to, for example, hire an additional teacher to accommodate, if one more non-resident student joined our district and we had to hire another teacher or more than one teacher because of student enrollment numbers, we could conceivably deny that enrollment based on the impact it would have on our budget.
And there was, I was trying to find an email, I couldn't find it, but it was from an individual who operates an independent school. They had mentioned that, I'm trying to recall it from memory as best as I can, but they had mentioned that public schools are able to deny admission if they find that a student or potential student is dangerous. Is there any accuracy to that? Or I couldn't find anything, but you would.
So I guess conceivably you could. And the limitation that would be if there was any, again, a protective factor, and that student was a member of a protected class, obviously be protected by existing anti-discrimination laws. I can think of one student who, without giving too much detail, had committed a crime in another district and could potentially have been considered dangerous, and we did enroll anyway. And the student ended up thriving in our school system and graduated. But could someone be disqualified based on posing a danger to the school community? Absolutely.
And last question.
Yeah, no, this is helpful.
Those, that discretion for the dangerousness piece, is that in the 2200 rules or is that elsewhere that I could find?
Again, for us, it would be something codified in New Hampshire law. And right, again, the Dresden School District.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
We're under the jurisdiction of New Hampshire law. So there is nothing specified in terms of what constitutes dangerous. We would assume that a student who was expelled had done something that would be considered dangerous. And that would be the sort of circumstance that would most likely inform my decision whether or not to enroll a student.
So would you just take a few steps back and tell us about your district and how it interacts with Vermont?
Sure. So roughly 1/3 of our students come from Vermont.
Okay.
As a result of a law that was passed in 1963, the last legislation I think that President Kennedy signed before he was assassinated, the Dresden Interstate School District was created. And the legislatures on both sides of the river had to pass enabling legislation to agree to some basic tenets, one of which is that the schools in Vermont would be governed by Vermont law, and the schools in the arrangement that were in New Hampshire would be governed primarily by New Hampshire law. And the roughly, as I said, 1/3 of our students come from Vermont. And when students finish 6th grade at Marion Cross School, they move across the river to Richmond Middle School and Hanover High School.
Why not?
Yes. Yeah. And there's an arrangement. There's a tuition calculation between the two districts. So there's a financial arrangement that's, again, spelled out in that interstate compact. And the voters in Norwich actually vote on the Dresden budget and are represented in that process. And what's really kind of strange is that the timing of town meeting is such that the number of voters who actually show up for that vote tend to be larger than the number of people that show up for the New Hampshire vote, because they separate their school district vote and their town vote. And so our Vermont residents hold a great deal of sway in the district.
Mr. Fenn, if there were a teacher that that really felt as though they were teaching a child that they just couldn't handle it, for whatever reason, what's that sort of process around if a child may need to go to either a therapeutic school or a more specialized school, if it even got that far?
Sure. Jay may add to this as well,
Yeah.
supplement certainly. But my understanding is that students on an IEP.
Yeah.
You might convene the IEP team and all those involved and determine where the best placement for that child would be, whether it's in that school or another school. And I think that's all by, agreement, if you will, by the team to see what's in the best interest of the student.
And if the child were not an IEP, that's when that process would get started. Getting them on an IEP.
Well, perhaps, yes,
Perhaps,
if necessary.
if that seemed like a necessary
Right.
way to do it.
I would simply elaborate if it's
Yeah,
okay.
please.
So there are provisions both in state regulations, but also in our own policy, which I've included for your review, that delineate who's responsible for what. So in essence, a sending school, maybe a non-operating school that selected Hanover to be their the high school choice. There's an arrangement that any excess special education costs are billed back to the district of residence. So, and I believe that's consistent throughout actually both states. And there is a provision in our own policies that if we find that we're unable to educate the student, that is, we believe they need an out-of-district placement, that decision is made jointly by the sending district and us, and in the context of the IEP team. And then we at that point would say that we're no longer able to educate this non-resident student, and the cost for sending that student to an out-of-district placement would fall back to the district of residence.
So my only question, just put my cards on the table with the admissions piece, frankly, is if making sure that the school fits the kid. That's really the big thing that I'm wondering about. Back to this, making certain that if a student were to, and I'm thinking actually more like a Compass school in these situations than any other school, that if the student wanted to go to the Compass school, it's just a good fit. And it sounds like the IEP process that this bill has in place, and kind of what Mr. Fannin mentioned, if the student were placed at Compass school, it would be through an IEP. It wouldn't just be driving up to the school and saying, okay, I've got my public dollars, my kid's gonna go here. It sounds like there's a more intentional process in that, from what I understand. Yeah.
Correct, yeah, that's a decision that would be made by an IEP team.
Anything else? Yeah, please.
Questions.
Please, yeah.
Your district is I think it's Hanover High School.
Yes.
Is it within 25 miles of the Vermont border?
Oh, yeah, it's a stone's throw from the Vermont border.
Just looking for counts. And if your seats were limited in any of your schools, whether the Vermont side or the New Hampshire side, is it if seats were limited, would it simply be first come, first serve, or is it by lottery? Or
We haven't operated a lottery, and as I said, as far as I can dig into the history, we've only had that situation once in the early 2000s, and right now we're currently under enrolled by probably 200 students, 150 to 200 students, so we have great deal of capacity.
Under enrolled.
But if
Yes,
it were,
yeah.
if you were over enrolled, what would your policies determine?
In the past, what they did was they set a date, and they accepted applications up until that date, and anyone who applied afterwards wasn't able to get in, is my understanding. We haven't used a lottery. I believe we could use a lottery, but it's currently not policy. It's just not been a situation that we've had to react to. But again, as I said, we've really, there's been one student that anyone can recall in 20 years that we've not admitted. And honestly, there's a financial incentive, right? So our tuition is pretty high. It's $22,000 and change this year. So it's against our economic interests as well to deny anyone enrollment.
Sure. Okay. And if you had a new student coming into your system from Ottawa, really from wherever, you do an exchange of records.
Correct.
Okay. You mentioned that earlier. Does that include academic history?
Yes, it does.
Thank
Right. And a really instructive document would be the district tuition agreement, because in that it lays out what we ask from the family and from the district that is tuitioning the student. And there's no academic requirement, there's no test score requirement, there's really nothing other than proof of residency and sign off that I'll pay tuition. There are a couple paragraphs that outline the information about special education that I referred to earlier.
Sure. And just to remind me, and I apologize, prior to the student arriving, transcript arrives, any kind of academic records go to the school.
Correct.
Anything else? Okay, great. Thank you both.
Thank you very much. And good luck with your work. I know this is challenging.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah,
So you guys are trying, thank you, Mr. Bannon, for being here, but Jay, thank you. You thanked us for our work, and I know being a superintendent is incredibly challenging and one of the hardest jobs, so thank you for being here today.
Oh, you're welcome.
And feel free to stick around. We're about to continue this kind of conversation with Ledge Council. We're gonna go kind of through a side by side, so anybody's welcome to stick around.
Wonderful.
If that helps.
Set you back for a 7 o'clock board meeting.
Verify, move on here. Okay.
Ready. So we asked, senators may recall, we asked the St. James to create a side-by-side document so that we can start to understand it is in our folders. Basically, what's in 483, what's in Title 16, what's in the 2200 series, and what's coming forward in Act 173, so that we can just get our heads around what, kind of understand the bill a little bit more, and also understand the interplay between Title 16, 2200 series, and Act 173. We'll do this for a little while, and then we'll have Mike P. check in. But for now, if you don't mind taking us through this, but before that, any questions on what we're about to do? Because I'm hoping, and this is the document, this St. James is the document.
Yes, and I'll explain how we use it.
Any questions before we get started? Because I think this will be helpful, and I think people will better understand what's in 483, how it interacts with these other three pieces of rule, legislation, et cetera, acts. And it also would be good for us to start to just get a sense of where people are. Do you like this section? If this section needs refining, do you have any questions? And we can, so as we go through, that would be helpful if people would start to do that. And I'll kind of keep a list since getting close to the end, kind of. Please.
Thank you. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. So as Chair Campion mentioned, I was asked to prepare a side-by-side of 4 different pieces of law. Even using legal paper, that was getting, I think, kind of lots of little black and white letters on the page. So what I've done is we have the language from 483 in the left-hand column. You all should be looking at this document, the side-by-side. Okay. So the language of 483, and for the side-by-side, I only focused on the new requirements on approved independent schools. I did not include the language that's more informing edits,
Okay.
like adding little pieces of language there. And I did not include any of the session law because it's all really implementing pieces here. So the left-hand column is 483. And then you have a column for each of Title 16, the 2200 series, and Act 173. I've put, if there is an applicable reference or similar provision in one of those 3 pieces of law, I've put the reference to it. And then I've given you either, like for the 2200 series, you have all of the 2200 series, Act 173, you have the approved independent school sections. And then Title 16, I pulled out the applicable sections. And there's highlighting throughout, and I will point you to the specific page and everything that we'll look at. It sounds complicated, but I don't think it will be, because you'll see that there's a lot of new provisions without similar provisions in current law.
Great.
Are we good to go?
Ready to go.
Okay. So, subsection B of section 166. So remember, section 166 is the approved and recognized independent school statute. That's current law for all of the requirements to be an approved independent school or a recognized independent school.
Okay.
Subsection B is the approved independent school section. And that is where H483 adds a whole new category of requirements. And that category is, that new category of requirements is, what does an approved independent school have to be if they want to accept public tuition? And that's what we've been calling subdivision 9. That's where all of those little new pieces fall under. So if we're looking at H483, the left-hand column, the lead-in language is, an approved independent school that intends to accept public tuition shall be approved by the state board as eligible to receive public tuition, only on the condition that the school complies with the following requirements, except it doesn't apply to therapeutic schools. So all of those little 1 through 10, I through X, are going to be those new requirements that we're trying to find whether there's analogous law already on the books.
Great.
Okay. So the
And
first,
just a reminder, therapeutic also pulls in special education schools.
those are the therapeutic schools.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Yep.
It's all the same.
There are there could be approved independent schools that are targeting specific populations of students with specific needs. The therapeutic schools are specifically defined, where we make a definition of that.
Great.
So the first piece we're going to look at, the first requirement we're going to look at is little I there. 1, the school agrees notwithstanding any provision of law to the contrary to enroll any student who requires special education services and who is placed in or referred to the approved independent school as an appropriate placement and least restrictive environment by the student's individualized education program team or by the local education agency. And then if you look to the right of that, you'll see there's an analogous piece of law in all 3 of those pieces of law. So Title 16, it's actually already effective July 1, 2023, coming out of Act 173. That language will be in the same statute.
Right.
If you take no action. And you
No
can-
action this year, we leave without passing 43, no matter what, special education stuff.
Little I will be in there.
Little
yes.
I will be there. Okay,
And you can
thank you.
see that if you look at the Title 16 language, which is just the Word document with a bunch of yellow on it. You'll see the first one there. This is language that will be in effect on July 1, 2023. And that highlighted language is almost verbatim of what's in 483.
Does it help in any way? So they may have put this in for a reason, maybe they didn't, maybe they, does it, if again, it's gonna happen no matter what, we could ask this of the House Ed Committee, why put it in?
So all 483 is doing is
Yeah.
moving this language to a different part of the same statute.
Okay,
So right now, come July 1, 2023, if you
Yep.
take no action.
Yep. Still there.
If you look at this, Title 16 language document, this is the lead-in language to the approved independent school section.
Okay.
So on application, the state board shall approve an independent school that offers elementary or secondary education if it finds, after opportunity for hearing, that the school provides a minimum course of study pursuant to section 906, that substantially complies with all statutory requirements for approved independent schools, which you are adding to in H483, and the board's rules for approved independent schools. That highlighted language is from Act 173. And if you take no action, would be in that introductory paragraph subdivision or subsection B. All H483 does is move it from that, so after B, there's 1 through 8 right now. For example, 8 is the financial reporting or accountability section. Section 5, subdivision 5 is their board's powers to suspend or revoke for not following rules. So there's all of these subdivisions under B. So you're just taking this language from subsection B and you're putting it in a different part of the same statute.
Thank you.
This language is also in the rules, the 2200 series. It's not as, it's kind of blended throughout the rules, so it's
Okay.
not as clear, concise statement.
Yep.
But I think a good place to look would be rules 2229.4, which is page 10, and that language should be highlighted for you. And it talks about accepting a student on an IEP. And then Act 173. Sections 20A and 21 are pages 51 and 52. Well, 20A is page 51, and that's the language that would appear in subsection 166B if you make no changes today. So Act 173 is what made the amendment to section 166, subsection 166B. So that language is covered in every place you're looking for.
It's gonna happen. Thank you.
Now we're going to get into some relatively newer requirements.
Okay.
So 2, I'm still on page 1. The school shall provide local education agencies with an attendance report for students attending the school in public tuition at an interval determined by and in a format approved by the agency. I don't believe there's a similar provision. There's certainly no similar provision in Act 173. And I don't believe that there is an analogous provision in Title 16 or in the 2200 series.
Any questions on that? Anybody need to hear from anybody else? Seems pretty.
Okay, we're going to go to page 2. 3, the school shall provide local education agencies with a report of the academic progress of students attending the school in public tuition. Again, you know, I do not believe there's a similar provision in either of these, any of those pieces of law. Same for 4, the school shall provide local education agencies with a report of any enrollment change for students attending the school in public tuition, including withdrawals, suspensions, or expulsions, provided the school shall notify a local education agency the same school day if the school is considering expelling a publicly tuition student. There might be actual practices in the field that already meet some of these requirements. But if we're looking at just Title 16, just the 2200 series or Act 173, which we're really not going to refer to at all again, because that's really just the special education piece. There's no specific direction like this.
Right. Seems to make sense. Do you want to report on? Yep. Okay.
5.
Questions?
So I'm still on page 2 here. The school has adopted and implemented policies and procedures to comply with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act and the Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act. There is no similar provision, and then there's no similar provision in Title 16. There is a requirement in the 2200 series, and those rules are on page 6 and page 8 of the 2200 series. And again, we're not going to talk about Act 173. That's not addressed in there. If the school meets the definition of the Public Accommodations Act, it already applies to them under Title IX. And the Fair Employment Practices Act also would apply to all of employers. So while Title 16 doesn't say you have to follow this, those pieces of law may naturally apply to these schools anyway. But here you are saying you have to have adopted and implemented policies and procedures and essentially show compliance with these acts through your adoption and implementation of those policies and procedures in order to be eligible to receive public tuition. So is everyone clear that while Title 16 doesn't require that explicitly, those pieces of of law may already apply to schools anyway.
And just to go back, we did this last year, Senate Bill 219 required this. This was the anti-discrimination. I mean, I described it in the St. James, correct me if I'm wrong. You cannot take public funds if you discriminate against protected classes. Or can't discriminate if you, I mean, what I usually say to people is, what we were trying to do is keep public dollars away from schools that would discriminate against LGBTQ faculty, staff, and others, is what I usually say.
So the Vermont Public Accommodations Act does not contain a religious exemption, but the Fair Employment Practices Act does. So there is an exemption in the Fair Employment Practices Act for religious employers when it comes to, I believe, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, at least sexual orientation.
And this does nothing to address that.
This just requires the school to adopt and implement policies and procedures to comply with the Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act. And if the Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act has an exemption in there,
Which it does.
yes, then this language does nothing about, it doesn't change that exemption in any way. This language doesn't change the Public Accommodations Act or the Fair Employment Practices Act in any way. This language. There is language later on in the bill that does amend the Public Accommodations Act.
Do you remember when that exemption was put in? I think I do, but I could be wrong.
I vaguely remember testimony that it's been in there for quite a while.
I want to say that's something to do with civil unions.
I want to say it was the 90s.
Yeah.
And I can certainly, I'll make a note of that. It's easy to look up.
Do we know why the House could have removed that exemption?
There's a legal possibility, yes, yeah.
Please continue.
In the 2200 series, in the two rules listed here on page 6, 22, 26, 26 is on page 6, and 22, 27.8 is on page 8, also require compliance with the Public Accommodations Act and the Fair Employment Practices Act. And Rule 22, 26 and Rule 22, 27 are in effect right now.
Okay.
Admissions process. So 6, the school shall not use an admissions process for publicly tuitioned students that includes mandatory interviews, academic entrance exams, academic history, mandatory campus visits, or consideration of ability to pay for any costs or fees. And I'm going to stop there. Title 16 doesn't have any prohibitions on an admissions process for an approved independent school. The 2200 series has language on pages 8 through 9 addressing enrollment, but it doesn't include any of these prohibitions. So I'm just highlighting here the state board's rules related to the enrollment criteria. So if you look at page 8 of the 2200 series.
Okay. Where am I finding that?
The 2200 series.
Oh, that's where that is. Thank you.
Page 8. There's a rule, so approval, since this rule is the approval to receive public tuition.
You are on 2229.1.
I'm starting at the very top, just
Okay.
looking at the title
Yeah.
of that section.
you.
So approval to receive public tuition.
Yeah.
And then you'll see rule 2229.1 is enrollment.
Okay.
And so none of this really matches up clearly to what's required in H483. So I'm just
Okay.
highlighting the fact that the state board rules does have information about the enrollment process. The most similar language, I believe, is subdivision 3 and 4. And so the state board rules require the schools, require them to maintain a written enrollment policy which shows the school's process for making enrollment decisions when the number of applicants exceed capacity, and that a student shall be accepted for enrollment in a non-discriminatory manner, and that the school's written enrollment, those students shall be denied acceptance for enrollment if the reason for the denial, et cetera. So.
Would you read that, continue going, no student shall be denied acceptance?
I may have to step out and take a sip of water.
No problem. I can,
The student shall be denied acceptance for enrollment if the reason for denial is that the student is disabled as defined in section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act 1973, or that as amended, or that the student is eligible for special education or undergoing a comprehensive evaluation process for special education. The student shall be denied acceptance for enrollment on the basis of race, creed, color, national origin, marital status, sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, or any other classification protected by state or federal law.
yeah, please, help me out.
More of a thought than a question. You know, I'm looking at the academic history part of section 6.
Mhm.
And I'm also looking at the section 2 of 2229.
Mhm.
Any special considerations for requirements for a student's acceptance for enrollment, which is something that the student or the parent has to voluntarily submit. So since the word mandatory is not in front of academic history in section 6 and 483, are those two concepts, do they mirror each other essentially?
Interesting. So the language in H 483
Yeah.
is that, so mandatory is only modifying interviews there,
Right.
and then later campus visits. So if you take those phrases out, the school shall not use an admissions process for public tuition students that includes academic entrance exams or academic history. So, go ahead.
So that means, okay. Yeah, I'll do it.
No, if you. go
I'm
right
not,
ahead.
I'm not sure, I'm
Okay.
just thinking right now.
So the 2200 series, the rule, subdivision 2 here in 2229.1 requires the school to let students know of any special considerations or requirements for a student's acceptance for enrollment. I probably should have highlighted this. Any special considerations or requirements for students' acceptance for enrollment. Then goes on to say none of which shall disadvantage a student based on protected class, student's actual or suspected disability, or the student's socioeconomic status. It doesn't necessarily, this I think is a broader concept than academic history or academic entrance exams. And so 483, oh, thank you very much. This is very kind. 483 would not prohibit special considerations or requirements other than academic entrance exams or academic history. But academic entrance exams or academic history would not be allowed to be a special consideration or requirement if 483 were to pass. So for example, a ski school. Your ski ability may be part of your enrollment process.
Yeah.
I don't believe that would
Prior to
fall-
483.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, so I don't believe that would fall under academic entrance exams or academic history. But it might be a special consideration or requirement for students' acceptance for enrollment. And, you know, I don't know if Vermont has a performing arts school, right? You might have to demonstrate your cello playing ability, or a hockey academy. So again, academic entrance exams and academic history would be prohibited under 483. 2200 series requires schools to publish any other special considerations that they would have for the enrollment process beyond academic history or academic entrance exams.
I mean, really, I'm just trying to get to the fact of making the process for both public and private schools to be similar. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
So, okay,
If I could also just say, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, the 2200 series, they do it, independent schools do need to accept everyone?
no.
No, okay. they can't just accept somebody based or,
They can't discriminate in their
Discriminate.
admissions process.
okay, in the admissions process. Okay,
But if they can't discriminate in the admissions process based on the categories enumerated in the 2200.
okay.
And 483 adds some things to that.
Yeah.
Rephrase your question so that I understand it better. Are you saying that you want the processes to be the same in a public or private school? Given if the private school is a school that accepts public dollars? Is that what you're saying?
I think it is.
Okay. Right, thank you.
It's,
Yes, I want some clarity on that one.
I'm still having different ideas marinate between these two things right now. Yeah.
Well, and remember, all we're looking at is independent school law. We're not looking at the public school law today. So that would be a whole separate side by side.
And the public schools, again, it's one from all,
You're a resident of that district.
that
yes.
district.
And then there's a non-resident enrollment statute that is very broad.
Okay, so that's where we see the differences. Okay, yes, Senator.
Sorry. So the academic history piece now is, I'm thinking back to when we were hearing about public school admission and the exchange of information if the student's been expelled. And the public school has discretion in that circumstance. It sounds like it isn't something that's used often to deny admittance, but it's something that they do have discretion for. That expulsion, is that something that would be considered under academic history, or are we just talking about report cards?
I think that as drafted, there's the potential for academic history to be ambiguous, and I would encourage you to hear testimony from the field on that. So for example, I know in post-secondary schools, transcripts will often contain a notation if there was a disciplinary action, but not all schools do that. I don't believe that there's any requirement in Title 16 about what a transcript would have to require. So I would encourage you to hear from the field on how that term would be interpreted.
Do you want to lead here?
I would just say-
Senator Jewett recommended it. I think it's a good point. Yeah.
For our purposes, academic would strictly be academic performance, that is grades, test scores, that sort of information. And there would be a separate behavioral or conduct report that would be separate from that.
So as written, this doesn't inhibit the transfer of that information. Behavioral.
Yeah.
Okay. Mark this part so we can get some information, additional information from the field. Okay.
So sticking with the same subdivision, so the school can't use an admissions process that includes the things we just walked through, but
Yeah.
the school may request proof of a student's most recently completed grade. The school may set a capacity limit on the number of publicly tuition students the school will accept. And the school shall establish a non-discriminatory selection process when the number of publicly tuition student applicants exceeds any capacity. Again, the 2200 series does require schools to publish their enrollment, their process for making enrollment decisions when there's a capacity issue. And then does require a non-discriminatory enrollment process.
So any independent school that's receiving public funds, school may request proof of the student's most recently completed grade.
I think so they know where to slot them in.
But what is proof?
I agree with you that I think that's it could be potentially ambiguous. I think that would be a great question for the field. I think what was contemplated is, all right, did you finish grade 10? Are you ready to move on to grade 11? Not how, how close to not moving on to grade 11 were you, but are you ready to move on to grade 11? I believe that was HouseEd's intent behind that language.
Sure.
We would rely on the student's transcript or grade report card for that information.
So in this case, by proof, if the school believes proof is a transcript or grade report, they set that standard
If the independent
in
school
the independent
does,
school.
I think that would be up between them and wherever the student was coming from to work
Okay.
that out.
If a student were to arrive, Jay, I guess this is for you, and you were not to see any transcripts, now again, the family could provide them, which I think would logically happen, but if you didn't see a transcript or a grade report before the student arrived, saying this can't happen, how do you place the kids either in honors math or remedial math or all that stuff? Just seems practical to see the grades.
Sure. And I'd say a great example would be we have students right now that are lining up that are refugees that are living in Poland and trying to transfer over.
Okay.
And don't have any records. So the way that we would deal with that is our counseling department would interview the student, do our level best to try to ascertain where they are. We also have placement tests that we use with existing students in reading and math, so we can at least get an idea where they are in those core subjects. And it would be the counseling department's job to determine what the most appropriate placement would be.
Mr. Robinson, you're with the group.
Mr. Collins, fine.
You're with the group. Can you just help me understand arriving at any school, public, independent, without that academic history? Why does that kind of make sense to you?
Rephrase your question.
So it says here, a school should not use in the admissions process anything with academic history. So I get it's the admissions process, but when does the school get to see the grades to say, all right, we're going to put the student here, that kind of
Sure,
thing?
understood.
Thank you.
As a practical matter, public schools enroll all students. I mean, my daughters attend school in Burlington. Both of them have Afghan refugees in their classrooms who were evacuated out of Kabul airport. Like, they are not arriving in those schools without those records.
Right, they have nothing.
So I think the scenario that was just sort of described is exactly what would play out. I think fundamentally what we're talking about here is trying to align two parallel systems, one being a public education system that enrolls all students who reside in that town, and a system of public vouchers that go to private schools, and saying, okay, if you are, what I believe is intended here is if you are a private school accepting public voucher dollars, then you wouldn't be sort of assessing that academic history to determine their admission. Public schools don't do that.
Right.
They assess to determine how to best educate that student when they arrive at their doors, because they accept all students.
So that doesn't preclude, so all of a sudden, a family or a school could say, we need your academic records before August 1st, period, in order to determine class placement, all that kind of thing, under this law.
Yes, 483 prohibits the use of those for
In
the admissions process.
Okay, please.
How- For example, how would they know what grade placement if they have capacity limitations? Grade 10 versus 11, how would they know if they have no records whatsoever? It's a pre-placement issue. It's a pre-acceptance issue to know if you've got a capability. I mean, it's not as simple as just delineating limitations.
So 483 does allow the school to request proof of the student's most recently completed grades. I think you just heard testimony that might be a transcript.
Mhm.
I think that's potential to vary between school and school.
Yep.
But that transcript could not then be used in the admissions process to say, you're under 483, you're not a right fit for us.
Right.
It could be used to say, oh, you're going to grade 10, we have a capacity limit there. And then what is their capacity? What is their they can set a capacity limit, and then they have to have a non-discriminatory selection process when the number of, if they get 2 people vying for no spots in grade 10, what does that look like if a spot suddenly opens up?
Just a hypothetical, English as a second language. Without seeing a student, but hypothetically having a student where English is a second language or English is not even spoken, how would you, and you put yourself in the position of an independent school, how would you determine if the student should be accepted into your curriculum, into your school, if there's potential that the English is, they speak no English, or they speak English which is not compatible with the 10th grade or whatever grade that they're theoretically being assigned to. I mean, so this is kind of a how would you know?
You have to hire a teacher.
Right, you have to hire a teacher. You don't have the English language capability, English as a second language capability. If you don't have that capability in your school, you have to have that knowledge, that background about the student to be able to accept it. I mean, so I understand that kind of like, acceptance, and then once accepted, then you place into the right, potentially the right grade or the right AP versus SHA, whatever the mix might be. But certainly it's not just a blank slate that any school can accept anybody based on any circumstance, which is kind of what's being asked.
Yes, Mary.
I'll pass, actually.
How do you handle that? ELL?
So, as I said before, it's hard for me to put myself in the place of an independent school because we are governed by the fact that we take everybody. So,
Right.
like when our
But do you
population-
ever ask about ELL students? Do you have any kind of application that might say, hey, should we be preparing to have an extra teacher as a part of the school?
Sure, one of our standard enrollment documents is a home language survey,
Okay.
in which they would indicate that they have need of those services.
A home language survey would be kind of like mandatory interview. It's a questionnaire. It's a mandatory questionnaire for placement. Isn't that kind of the idea of why you would give them that?
Again, it's a federally, we're obligated under Title III to do just that. We have to survey in fact, we have to provide that survey to all students, all families. That's what we would use to identify the need for ESL. And again, it's Title III. So as long as we accept federal funds, we must comply.
So since we're dealing with hypotheticals, let's say you have a student who speaks a language that you don't have a teacher who can work with that, and you're just not able to find one. What do you do in that circumstance?
So teachers, speakers of other languages are not obligated to know every language that they might encounter. And so it's not a qualification or obligation under the law.
So sorry, I meant, what happens to the student? I mean, do they still go to the school, and how do they get services if they don't speak English at all, if you can't find any staff?
So there are degrees of services that are provided depending on whether a person has any language skills or none. There's often a test that's administered to determine what those levels are. And I can't speak for all, I feel like the spokesman for field. There are
a lot of you kind of on the border, a lot of
Sure.
schools like you on the border.
Well,
around
and
the state.
it's, I would say, but having been a superintendent in Pennsylvania, we're under the same federal obligations, we have the same laws, same processes. So, there is a testing regimen that is sometimes used and purely for placement purposes. And then there are different models of providing those services, but each of them has a certain amount of sheltered instruction where they're gaining competence with the English language, as well as content. And then they are gradually released to greater levels or reduced levels of that sort of intervention, and then ultimately are in regular classes with itinerant support.
Thank you.
Sure.
But yeah, Mr. Robinson.
Colin Robinson, Vermont 88. Just to that, I mean, remember the conversation here is about independent schools that choose to accept public dollars, right, to be eligible to accept public dollars. So public schools accept all students and meet those needs of those students to the best of their ability under all the legal requirements. And what's sort of contemplated here is private schools that choose to accept public dollars and the standards upon which that they would be eligible to receive those public dollars. So Senator, perhaps a school determines that that's not something that's within their purview to be able to provide. So maybe they wouldn't be in a situation to be able to, they might choose not to accept public dollars. Right?
Well, sure, but the scenario we're looking at here is schools that are currently providing education to a subset of students in the state. And if this bill passes and they can't accept all of the criteria which all public schools accept, then they don't get their students. Their students aren't, and then the district has got to scramble to figure out what to do with those students. So, certain schools will accept this and certain schools are really going to struggle with this. So we're going to potentially wound a subset of schools and the related students who are going there now. That's kind of what I'm boiling it down to. Not every school can accept every acceptance criteria that a public school accepts right now. That's the fundamental problem. That's what we're boiling it down to.
Sure. Is this admissions piece, was this complaint driven? Had there been a lot of complaints, or where did this sort of the genesis of, or was this kind of the house thing out? Do you know if there were a lot of parents that wrote in and said, hey, this is really uncomfortable, we don't like this?
I would absolutely encourage you to hear again from the chair of House Education on their specific
So
event.
the NEA did not propose, or the Equity Alliance did not propose this language?
No,
Okay.
I would, to be very clear, and although I'm not speaking on the totality of the Equity Alliance, I will say this bill was created by the House Education Committee. We provided comments at a point in the process, but I would encourage you to hear from the committee on that.
So we're on page 3 now. We're looking at number 7. School shall provide the results of all state mandated assessments of students on public tuition to the Agency of Education, which shall publish the results on the website in a manner consistent with the publication of the same results for public school students. There's a very similar provision already in section 166, which if you look at your Title language is at the bottom of the first page. 166G, an approved independent school that accepts students for whom the district of residence pays tuition under Chapter 21 of this title shall use the assessment or assessments required under subdivision 164.9 of this title, which is state board standards to measure attainment of standards for student performance of those students. In addition, the school shall provide data related to the assessment or assessments as required by the secretary.
Yes, Jack?
Sorry, there is a big distinction there between the language of the proposed legislation and that language. In that, at a recent meeting of the Superintendent's Association, I asked all of my colleagues how many people have ever even seen the assessment results for their independent schools, and one person raised her hand, and that was only because she requested them. I think the difference in language is that they will be published on the website. So if you try to find them now, you will not find them.
For whom?
For independent schools.
Independent schools, okay. And this is saying that school shall provide the results for all students. And Ms. St. James, you're saying this is in 16 VSA.
It's similar.
How is it different?
Well, there's no publication requirement in subsection G.
Okay,
And the language is slightly different. G is very specific. The assessment or assessments required under subdivision 164.9. And this is a little broader, state mandated assessments. I think it's very likely that those are going to match up, but it's not the same language.
and we require the same with the public schools.
I don't know if this, so this language in H 483 is to require publication of the same results, in a manner, require publication in a manner consistent with the publication of the same results for the public school students. And I don't know off the top of my head, what that looks like for public school students.
You publish your academic results
We're forced to, yes.
So you are.
Correct. There's a dashboard
by the state of New Hampshire.
on both
By
states.
both states. Okay.
Eight, the school's tuition rate for publicly tuitioned students shall be the same as or lower than the tuition rate for private payer students. And both tuition rates shall be published on the school's website and reported to AOE annually. There's no current similar provision in any of those three pieces of law.
Tuition rate, publicly tuition. Okay. Any questions on that section? Good.
I got a question. If it's more of a procedural question, but if this bill passes.
Yeah.
483, and so does that change, is that gonna change Title 16?
483, the language that we're walking through in that left-hand column
Yep.
is a proposed amendment to Title 16, Section 166.
How about,
There's nothing in H 483 that requires the state board to reopen the rules. They may choose to.
Right.
But there's nothing that requires rulemaking.
May I just go back to the admissions question one more time? And I don't know if this is for Mr. Robinson, but you might be able to help. Can a public school still expel a student?
I would defer to the superintendent.
You can expel a student.
Absolutely.
So you can expel a student, okay.
Student has due process rights, and it's, as I said earlier, quasi judicial process where there's representation that's provided or can be provided.
And also, obviously, I
I'm
think,
just trying to understand it in terms of everybody's here, we've got everybody.
Sure. I'm sure somebody could speak to the specific numbers. I believe expulsion is exceedingly rare at this point as a general practice. But also, you have publicly employed educators, a publicly accountable superintendent, a public school board, who would all be involved in that process. So there's public accountability and transparency to the electorate involved in that process as well.
Expulsion.
Sure. I mean, as a
Yeah.
general
Yeah.
general concept, right?
What would happen, where do students go when they're expelled? Generally,
So that is a great question because
because the schools are saying no, because of whatever reason.
and we're not required by law to accept students that have been expelled elsewhere, yet there's still an obligation to provide some sort of alternative education. And especially if the student has a 504 or an IEP, we then have an even different set of rules that we need to follow that would ultimately end up with us having to at least provide tutoring or some sort of ongoing education.
If a student is expelled in Randolph, whatever school, Bennington, they move up to your area, you don't have to take them if they've been expelled.
We do not have to take them by state law in both states.
Okay. Thank you.
Before you kick back off, I just want to-
Yeah.
So I'm not going to make a comment, just we need to revisit on 8, VII, about tuition. I need to go back to the notes because it's probably been over a month on whether some of these independent schools enjoy an endowment, which affects the price of tuition, which, you know, it's a benefit, which obviously public schools don't enjoy, to my knowledge. So I'm just putting it out there that the endowment question, I think, is relevant in this case. It needs to be revisited.
And where do you see that, just so I can?
On 8, VII.
Yeah.
Page
Okay.
3.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that, I mean, I understand the intent, but the unintended impact is that endowments may have a positive effect on a independent school's tuition rate versus what a public school might have to charge a student because there is no endowment.
did Act 60 change if a public school had an endowment? Didn't Act 60 change that?
There is no prohibition on fundraising right now.
Right.
So,
But public schools also.
right.
Yeah.
There's, I think Act 60 and Act 68. I think the commentary would be it changed perhaps the need for fundraising, or the, attractiveness of fundraising, like for all of the effort involved. But there's no prohibition on fundraising.
How long do we have you?
I guess as long as you need me.
Okay. I'm going to, just for my own needs, take a 5-minute break right now and then come back. Because we finished up our other work, so we'll just keep